good to keep an eye on things. Right, we'll kick off in just a moment. So what we're going to start with is Annette, who you probably know is my wife, has sort of developed a parallel interest. We both sort of work on the bees, but I guess possibly me more, and Annette has done some of the sort of stuff that I have maybe not as much interest in. So wax wraps have been a thing for a while now, as people become more conscious of their their use of plastics, and as people have become more conscious of it, they've wanted to reduce on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just waiting to see that this switches over. Sorry, I've got a big lag on my phone before I sort of see what's going on, so I'm just going to wait for the picture to change and then hand over to Annette, which hopefully will be in the next 10 seconds or so. Or if not, then we have to work out what we're doing. So yeah, so it should be just about to change, I think. Yep, here we go. Okay, so we've got the slides for this presentation. I'll be back with you in 10-15 minutes. Enjoy.
So, hello everyone, I'm Annette, and hopefully you'll find this talk interesting. We're going to talk about making beeswax wraps. As Ian alluded to, one of the main reasons people want to do this is that there's about 1.2 billion metres of cling film made every year in the UK, which is about 30 times round the world. Most of this is non-biodegradable plastic, which obviously uses up oil reserves as well. A lot of it ends up in landfill, where it will not biodegrade, and some estimates suggest up to 20 or 30% of cling film can end up in the sea, which will then potentially damage wildlife, cause fish or other animals to choke, or just be ingested, fill up their stomachs, and then they're not very happy. There's also some concerns about harmful chemicals in the film that may damage human health, although the evidence on this isn't strong. So why do we make wraps? Save money, get rid of the plastics, help the planet. It's quite fun to do, and most beekeepers will have a free supply of wax on hand. If you haven't got any wax, or you've traded it all in for foundation, then you can actually buy wax quite easily online. You can either buy pure beeswax, or you can actually buy beeswax mixes, which I'll come on to later in terms of once we deal with the recipes. The wraps are usable for a long time, and when they wear out you can refresh them. Eventually, when they're completely worn out, you can put them on the compost heap if you use the right type of fabric. So what do we need? I've got a nice picture here of most stuff. You need cotton fabric ideally. Sorry, this is clicking through far too fast. The cotton fabric is ideal, and we need to choose either a strong pattern ideally, or a dark colour, because it doesn't show up the dirt quite so easily, or if your wax isn't pure, then you will get marks that haven't shown up. Sorry, if your wax isn't very clean, then the wax will show up if you use a white fabric. We need a grater for grating wax, depending on what the method is. Wax, obviously you need a baking tray if you're going to use it in the oven, and some greaseproof paper. Ideally the fabric is quite light weight, if you're buying it online, about 120 grams per square metre is the description. If you use a fabric that's too thick, then A, it takes a lot of wax, and B, it will not mould quite as well around the things that you're trying to cover, depending on what you're trying to use. Sorry, those slides have scrolled through slightly quicker than I'd thought, and not quite sure how to fix that, so I'm just carrying on. When you get to starting to make your wraps, then you would need to cut. Right, so this is a fabric to avoid because it's got, you can see in the corner here there's some marks where there's some impurities come out from the wax, or if your wax isn't perfect, or it's also, if you put it over the top of, say, a tomato sauce or something, then it will stain quite easily. We try and avoid artificial fibres. When you cutting your fabric, ideally you use what's called pinking shears, which as you can see in the picture will provide this kind of slightly jagged edge, which basically reduces the chances of your fabric fraying, and helps your wraps last longer. You need to have a think about what you might use your wraps for in terms of you cutting what sizes you're going to cut. Obviously, if you're going to wrap, say, half an apple or half an avocado to put it in the fridge, you'll need a smaller wrap than, for example, if you're going to wrap your sandwich to take it to work to avoid putting cling film around it. You may also want to consider what shape things you're going to wrap. So if you've got a casserole dish that's round and you're commonly going to use your wrap to cover that to put something in the fridge, then you might want to do a round one. But you don't have to. It's quite easy to mould things into the shape that you want. And so the next step is to think, well, what recipe am I going to use? And there's two different ways of doing it largely. Firstly, you can just use beeswax on its own, which is very simple, very easy, obviously free. For those of us that don't want to spend any extra money, if you've got bees already, you just use your normal beeswax and you don't need to use any extra ingredients. It works pretty well. The wraps end up fairly soft, but sometimes it won't kind of stick around. Say you've got a round bowl or a jug, sometimes, particularly when they've been in use for a while, it doesn't stick as well, which then means that we move on to the option of a mixture. So there's various different recipes. If you go online, you'll find lots of different things. They involve beeswax. Jojoba oil is the traditional one. If you look at most recipes, you can use olive oil as well. Jojoba is said to be slightly antibacterial, and then you also use pine resin, which you can either buy as powder or you can buy as sort of little granules, little in easy to use form. Again, you can buy all these online. The pine resin is also partly antibacterial. This recipe generally has more, makes the wraps more tacky, sort of, as in that it will hold its shape better. So for example, if you put in the wax wrap around a bowl to put something in the fridge, the wrap will be more likely to stay on the bowl. What you have to do basically is put the wrap over the bowl, use your hands to hold the wrap in place, and the warmth of your hands will soften the wax and help it to stay in the right shape. So if we go through the first method, which is just using beeswax, the first thing to do is grate your wax. Often the best thing is to have a separate grater for this, and don't leave it on the kitchen counter where your children might think it's grated cheese and take a great lump in their mouth. They're not very happy about when they realise it's wax. So you need to grate plenty. reasonably fine, but it doesn't have to be. And then you put your fabric on your baking tray. Again, ideally an old baking tray that you're not too bothered about, and possibly if you can use a separate one. The ones we've got are just sort of literally from the pound shop that are non-stick, and they're dead easy to use. So you put your fabric on and you basically sprinkle the wax on the fabric. If you look at the red one, in hindsight I think I probably didn't put enough wax on this one, but again it's a matter of it's a bit of a learning curve, learning how much to put on so that you put enough on but not too much. And then once you've sprinkled your wax on, you put it in the oven, usually about 80, 90, 100 degrees C, no more than that, because if you put it in too high a temperature, well, you don't need that, and also you've got the risk of damaging your wax. And so basically you leave it in for a few minutes, and hopefully you then have a melted wax on it. And what you can see with this slide is that there's a few little bits, when you pick it up and you look at it in the light, there's a few little bits where the wax is not fully covering the fabric, and if that happens, what you do is just add a bit more wax on top of it and put it back in the oven. If you're making a large wrap, say for a casserole dish, or if you want to wrap a whole loaf of bread, then you can fold the fabric in two before you put it on. Obviously you will have to make sure that you put wax either in the middle or you put it on the top and then turn it over, and just make sure that you get enough that way. It's simpler if you can do a single thickness, but if you want a big one, then it's dead easy to do. You just fold them in half. If you're doing lots of little ones, obviously you can do several on the tray at the same time. And then we reheat the one where we've added a bit more wax, take it off the tray, put it on some baking parchment or greaseproof paper just to let it set. Some people have a piece of string hang up or whatever, and they just peg it on, whichever, and obviously make sure you don't burn your fingers when you're taking it off the paper. You can use tongs if you want it to. To be honest, I find it's actually much easier just to do your fingers and do the job quite quickly. And there's your first wrap made. So the other method, if you're doing a mixture, is that you get your beeswax, whichever oil you're using, and your pine resin, and you put all the ingredients in a bain-marie and melt it. There's various different recipes, as I say. Some use more pine resin, some use less, and I think you have to sort of have a little fiddle about it. The first recipe I've tried uses about 50-50 beeswax and pine resin, but I actually think from that experiment I thought that was slightly too high a proportion of the pine resin. I've seen other recipes where you use about 70% pine resin of the weight of beeswax you've got. So again, try and use a container that you won't need for anything else, because trying to get the residue off something that you're then going to eat out of is well, it's quite laborious really, and it then discourages you from making more wraps when you need them. Whereas if you've got one already, you're just like, okay, that's fine, I'll use it, and then when you've finished, you just put it in a storage place, and then use any residual wax that you haven't used, you just can melt again next time. Keep stirring it, obviously, to get the pine resin to melt. Try and avoid overheating it. It's not a great idea to do this in the microwave because you just can't get the control on the heat. It can often heat unevenly, and you don't want to risk having a fire in your microwave. So just do it over a bain-marie. And once it is liquid, you basically get your paintbrush or your silicone brush and brush the mixture onto the fabric as quickly as you can. It's a little bit easier to do this if you've pre-warmed the fabric on the tray, in the oven, and you need to do it reasonably quickly, and you put it back in the oven as we did with the previous method. If you find it's a bit uneven, you just take the fabric out and you jiggle it around a bit. Often there's bits of wax or mixture left on the tray, and you just rub the bits where you haven't got full amount of wax on the tray, just to kind of make sure that the wax is evenly distributed. And there we have it. So at the end you need to make sure that you again put it on the greaseproof paper so it can dry, and at the end you want to make sure that you clean your baking tray for the next time, ideally. So when it's hot out of the oven, you get your kitchen towel and clean it as much off as you can. Alternatively, if you're having a dedicated tray, you can just leave the wax on and use that up the next time. Wraps will not last forever. Some of the wax comes off or they get a bit tatty. You can quite easily refresh the wraps by kind of just doing the process again, by taking your old wrap, give it a good clean, and then you reapply the wax to it. And that's really quite simple. The one thing I would say is if you're using wraps, it's important not to use them for raw meat, because obviously there's a food hygiene issue there. Stronger flavoured things, some people will say avoid spicy things, but the main thing is obviously avoiding raw meat. As I say, ideally you put them over food that is either that's cool, because if you put a wrap over, say, a hot casserole dish, then the wax will melt and that will kind of distort the wax, or it'll melt it off your wrap, which doesn't really work terribly well. And that's about it really. So it's quite a satisfying thing to do, and I certainly in our house we have used significantly less cling film since doing this, and I've actually quite enjoyed making them. Hope that's helpful for you. Okay, and I'm going to hand over to Ian now for the next parts of the talk, with hopefully a smooth switch over.
Okay folks, hi there. Thank you very much to Annette for doing that. As Annette says, kind of, you're not going to replace maybe 100% of all the cling film is the word, thank you, I was looking for, but you'll significantly reduce it, which I think is kind of handy. It certainly worked for us, and that's yeah, it's, if you've got a bit of beeswax around, give it a go. It's just a bit of fun to play with. So on to Varroa. Varroa is a pain. It's been kicking around in the UK since about the early 1990s. About 1992 was when people first sort of started reporting it, and for quite a while it was a notifiable disease alongside EFB, AFB, sort of Tropicalaps and small hive beetle. Sooner or later, and I'm not sure exactly what date it was, it became so endemic across the country, the bee inspectors just couldn't kind of cope with it anymore, so it dropped off that list and just became a pest that we all have to live with. It also took a lot of beekeepers with it. The real kind of low point of beekeeping in the UK was probably in sort of the early part of the 21st century, back in sort of late 90s, early part of the 20th century, when what we had was a lot of beekeepers, the management style that they'd been used to of looking at their colonies occasionally when they thought they might swarm changed fundamentally, and it became a much more labour intensive task, with sort of issues of kind of having to watch what they were doing and manage the Varroa levels, because it did kill a lot of colonies. So the mite that we're looking at, we've got that lovely picture of it sort of there, this oval shaped mill, bit over a mill kind of by 1.5 mil with the 8 legs at the front. On a bee, it looks a bit like that, which if it was on you, I mean, people sort of say it'd be about the size of a cat or a dinner plate. If you've got something like that parasitic living on you, you probably wouldn't be terribly happy with it. So it just puts it in sort of scale a little way. So Varroa destructor is its name. There are some subspecies and they're so similar. It wasn't until relatively recently the scientists managed to work out that there were very subtle differences between them. But it's a parasitic mite. It lives off honeybees. The problem is that unless you control it, or unless it is controlled, numbers can grow significantly until it overwhelms a colony. It's the number one killer of bees globally, of European honeybees. Other species of bees have learnt to coexist with it, and they coexist with it to a degree that means that it's not an issue with them. But that's taken millions of years of evolution. Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee, manages the population in various ways, and that means the two coexist. European honeybees haven't got that trick yet. We'll talk a bit more about that later. But this is what we're looking at. Hairy little monster. So, will Varroa kill my bees? It's most countries now. The map, basically, if you can't see it in too much detail, if it's red, it's got Varroa. Australia doesn't yet, although they have had various incursions in the northwest of Australia, and they're fighting one at the moment. So they know that they're going to be it's going to hit them at some point. So we said arrived in the UK in '92. We've also sort of said that European honeybees don't have the co-evolved status, and they haven't kind of learnt the techniques to manage it themselves yet. The National Bee Unit's line on it is when Varroa populations overwhelm a colony, it leads to a disease called varroasis. So Varroa is the pest, varroasis is the disease, if you want to see it that way. If left untreated in an infested colony, will usually die within 2 to 3 years. So that's the official line on it. Varroa doesn't normally kill bees directly. It's parasitic. It's in no interest of it to kill its host. However, it will progressively, as the numbers build up, weaken and weaken them. And the biggest way it does it is by spreading pathogens, by spreading diseases and viruses. And that is what can cause the issues. Up until recently, it was thought that Varroa fed on the hemolymph, the blood of the bees. But Samuel Ramsey in his research a couple of years back has kind of proved pretty much without question that it's the fat bodies of the bees that the Varroa are feeding on, and that's where it kind of causes devastation, because the fat bodies are something that bees are really reliant on for winter survival. So it attacks that, and it's also because it pierces the exoskeleton of the bees to get to kind of it will pass pathogens in, and that isn't always a good thing. If you want a single source to go to about Varroa, these National Bee Unit leaflets that are on their website, you go to BeeBase, you go onto a sort of one of the menu bars called advisory leaflets, and you'll see a whole range of it. This Managing Varroa one is really excellent. I mean, all of these leaflets are very well produced. They're world standard, they really are. And it will take you through a lot of what we go through tonight, and a lot more as well in detail. It's downloadable. You can get print copies from the seasonal bee inspectors. Trouble is, sometimes things like Samuel Ramsey's research means that the whole thing has to be sort of pulped and rewritten. So these days they rely more on the downloads than the hard copies. So grab a copy. There's some very useful things in it. Okay, so about our little friends. They'll often live on this bottom left picture, bottom right picture even. They'll often live on the underside of the bees, so even if there's lots in a colony, you might not spot them, because they can sometimes get easier access into the through the exoskeleton in the abdominal kind of joints underside. So just not seeing them isn't doesn't mean they're not there. But you can also see them on the comb and on the backs of bees. They're small, so you have to have pretty sharp eyes. If you can't see eggs, you probably won't be seeing Varroa. So about the mites. The issue is with the female mites. And those are the ones that you're almost always going to see. The males have a different life cycle, and you actually very rarely see them. So we've got this flat, red, shiny surfaced oval. Even though they're hairy, when you see them on a Varroa board, they'll appear shiny. About 1.5 long by 1.1 wide, with 8 legs, which are all kind of offset to the front. There's another pest that looks vaguely like it called Browler, which is actually very rare in the UK at the moment. And Browler is kind of a different shape, and its legs are kind of evenly spread down the sides. So it's Varroa's distinctive. The life cycle of Varroa is a female mite is attracted to a cell just before, by the pheromones from a cell just before it's sealed, so it can tell. It nips in, starts the life cycle of the next generation. Once the cell's sealed, it starts to lay eggs, and the female will continue to lay eggs. The first mite to hatch out is the male, and the male then mates with her sisters. Top little mite, this one. And the male doesn't survive once the cell's opened. Because it pierces the pupa, this is when the problems start with, as it transfers the sort of the viruses from it into the pupa. Varroa prefer drone cells because the drone cells are sealed for that 3 days longer. 21 days for the worker, 24 days for the drone. At 24 days, they almost get another cycle of raising another Varroa mite. The female gets another cycle at it. So she will prefer, and again they can detect worker from drone, so they can detect when a drone cell's about to be sealed, and they've got a preference for them. Which is why one of the methods of tackling Varroa is drone uncapping, which can either give us an idea of the scale of the problem, or it can be a method of treatment. And once attached, as we've said, phoretic is a phrase you often hear discussed with Varroa. What it means is the stage where the mite is actually on the adult bee is the phoretic stage. That's all. Simple as that. The stage where it's in the cell is not the phoretic stage. So here we've got the little life cycle. So with 0, the cell's sealed with the mite in it. The mite heads down to the bottom of the cell, starts laying eggs, and then the eggs are progressively hatch out. Male first, followed by the females, and the gestation period is sort of 5 to 6 days for the males, 7 to 8 days for the females. Then mating occurs between brother and sister, and the Varroa mite dies before the cells open again. Young female Varroa mites and the mother then emerge from the brood cell when the adult bee hatches out or emerges, and then they're on there for life. Now they might move off their host bee into the hive, but that's another issue. So what can we kind of do about it? The threshold for a problem is considered to be 1,000 mites a colony. Now that's a pretty hard thing to judge objectively, but that's what the number given is, and there are various tools we've got for being able to judge when that point's been crossed. The key thing for us to do, if you do nothing else, is to monitor the Varroa. So somewhere in the kit that you'll have got, or the equipment that you have, you will probably have this bit of Corex. Sometimes it's a bit of wood, sometimes it's metal, which will slide under the floor of your open mesh floor. And most people are on open mesh floors these days, which is one thing for Varroa. Put that board in, leave it for a week, take it out, count the Varroa, divide it by the number of days, look at the little chart in the booklet we were talking about earlier from National Bee Unit, hey presto, you've got a guide as to whether you need to think about treating or not. As a rule of thumb, if you were to count it and the level at any time of year was above 10 a day, you need to start taking action. However, the level that is considered a threshold varies a bit during the year. But certainly if you've had it in for 7 days and you're counting over 100 mites, you're in the zone where treatment may well be a good idea. This is the little chart I was talking about, the little graph I was talking about in the MBU booklet. So you've got the month of the year, you've got the number of Varroa from your average mite count. Remember, the average mite count is the total number of Varroa that fell on that board in, say, a week, divided by the number of days. So as you see, for most of the year, the division between the orange and the red is at about between 8 and 10. In the early part of the year and the very tail end of the year, it's significantly lower. So if you, at this time of year, put your board in for 7 days and it came back with, and you counted a drop of more than 70, you would be starting to think, I might need to take some action here. Good reference guide in the little leaflet. Because Varroa is so widespread, don't kid yourself into thinking that you're the one person who's never had Varroa in your hive. It's probably because you're not looking or you're not monitoring significantly. You might be one of the very few lucky people, but you'll probably have it there at some point. We will have a conversation in a bit about the appropriate methods of dealing with Varroa. And it needs to tie in with your beekeeping, but at the same time, it needs to also be a solution to a problem. If you ignore it completely, it can bite you, and that's not good for you as a beekeeper, and it's not good for the bees either. So there's a range of options, and as I say, the critical thing is knowing if you have a problem or not. A lot of people get kind of quite twitchy about some of the treatments, but there's no point in treating if you don't have an issue. So if the levels of your Varroa are consistently low, then you've no need to treat. So the debate is almost hypothetical at that point. Okay, so we've talked about the life cycle. What about the seasonal cycle? So we know that honeybees, which is the blue line in the curve here, they're picking up to about their peak now or in the next few weeks, and then they'll diminish. Varroa is a slightly later peak. So the Varroa peak is often late summer, August time, and that's when we can do a big treatment then. The point of a treatment in autumn is A, the population of Varroa is possibly at its maximum, but B, at that point in time, your bees are the bees that are being born there that are going to be the bees that survive through winter. They need to be the healthiest bees feasible. If they're heavily parasited with Varroa, that's going to affect their kind of their ability to get through winter. So that's a kind of key moment to kind of get involved then. What this little graph tries to tell you is, hey, there's a range of different treatments out there. What ones should I consider? So what the dotted line here shows you is that's what would happen with a population left untreated. It would just continue growing. At some point it would hit a maximum, but it would be quite a high maximum. It's off the top of the graph. So the sawtooth line is if you treated with icing sugar. So you can see it has if used regularly, it has a small but temporary effect on the Varroa. Not a massive effect, but it does have some effect. So it could be part of something, but it maybe isn't the whole answer. A thymol treatment, which is something like Apigard or something, or one of the treatments involving thymol is thyme, the herb thyme, in a concentrated form. Thymol treatment in August, September can have a very significant 90% sort of knockback or more. That's a good one. Oxalic acid treatments used in midwinter when all the bees, there's very little brood, and all the mites will be on the bees, so oxalic acid can have the maximum effect. Can also have a good 90% plus knockdown rate and is a highly effective one. So sometimes it's these things used together, which gets called integrated pest management, but we'll talk a bit about that in a little while. So it's not one magic bullet. It's a bit like weeds in your garden. You have to keep on with different things at different times of year to keep yourself in control. So sampling boards, we talked a little bit about this. So you've got your monitoring board. It should slide in under the open mesh floor. You pop it in. 7 days is the recommended, because if you put it in for 2 days, you might get an odd sample that might not be average. So 7 days is what they recommend. The ideal times to do it are as you come out of winter, about now, towards the end of summer, late July, and then early winter, just before you're thinking about doing some of the treatments, because you want to know if there's a problem or not. Some people just use the board as it is, some people put Vaseline or things like that on it, so the mites are more liable to stick to it, so you might get a better indicator. A monitoring board is a fairly crude way of judging if you've got a problem, but believe me, if you've got a problem, you will know, because you'll see hundreds of mites on there. We talked about the way that Varroa prefer drones. Now, if you've got a lot of drones in your hive or drone brood, you can take an uncapping fork. You can slice into the drones, but they need to be fairly mature drones before they hatch out. They need to be at what they call the red eye stage. So they need to be sort of probably about 18-20 days plus gestation. As you fork out those mites, as you fork out the larvae, if you're seeing Varroa on more than 5 to 10% of the drones you're pulling out, then you have an issue. So drone uncapping is a different way of kind of monitoring. It's a more invasive way, but it can be used. One thing on drone uncapping and also drone trapping, drones are there for a reason. They're not just disposable, so just have a think, because you want good mated queens, and if you've just freshly forked out all your drones, you've limited the drone population. So just keep that in the back of your mind if you're thinking about that technique. It's got some good aspects, and bee inspectors will use it regularly, but it also has a little bit of a potential downside. There are some other methods which I have to be honest with you, I haven't really used, so I can point you out where to find more information about them. But you can do an alcohol wash where you put bees in alcohol, basically, and you it does kill the bees, and you need a sample of bees, a significant sample, probably about sort of a couple of hundred bees. And then once you've killed them, you strain the fluid off and you count the number of Varroa. It's accurate, but it does have that impact, and people, because they might be a bit sort of wary of doing something like that, might not want to go there. A sugar shake method is another method where you put a sample of bees in a jar. You put amounts of icing sugar in there. You shake the jar up, you shake all the dust off. The bees aren't harmed, they'll groom themselves back and they'll be fine, they can go back in the hive again. But you shake off the icing sugar and you count the mites in the leftover sugar, and it'll give you a sample. As I say, not use them. They do have a greater degree of accuracy. They use kind of a lot in other countries quite extensively as better methods, but they're more invasive methods, and not everybody's keen on those. If you want to go there, read up on them. Back to our little graph again. We need to just be aware that we can hit a tipping point. If you're going to treat, then there's no point treating the one colony that was a little bit over the threshold and leaving the 4 that were a little bit under it in the apiary. Or even if there was 2 and one was a bit high and one was a bit low, treat the whole apiary with whatever you're going to treat with, because to leave one is leaving a reservoir where the problem's just going to come back from. So it's just worth doing a whole apiary. Again, this is a little chart out of the National Bee Unit leaflet. So it goes through the types of treatments that are on offer, the months that you can use them in, and as I said before, it's this idea of integrated pest management (IPM). It's using multiple treatments. So a lot of us are using open mesh floors, and as you can see, that's green across the board because they stay on all year round. We've talked a little bit about drone removal, where you can use that as a technique, although you may just want to consider the possible downsides. Queen trapping rather, where you trap the queen on a comb so she can only lay in a certain area, and then you sacrifice that comb because all the varroa should have gone into there, is another method. Again, it's quite involved, and you may find that that's not a method for you. MAC strips are mite away quick. It's a chemical, it's formic acid. It can be used. Some people have got a dislike for it because it's got a bit of a reputation as a queen killer. Some of the dosing instructions, people feel, even though you should always follow the dosing instructions, some people feel the dosing instructions tend to be on the high side, especially for small colonies, and it can become a bit toxic and cause problems. Other people swear by them and love them. All I can say is know the pros and cons before you go there. The thymol treatments, the ones that use thyme, often used late summer, early autumn. Apiguard, Apilife and Thymovar, they are effective. They can be a bit fiddly to use. They can take a sort of, with Apiguard, you've got to put 2 of these trays in over a period of a month or more. You can often find that's the period when you want the bees to start feeding as well. And if you've got those treatments on, the bees often won't take syrup down. So you've got this, which is the bigger problem? Which do I need to do most of? The Apistan, the Baverol, the Apitraz, and the Polyvar Yellow are what they call hard chemicals. So they often involve the pyrethroids. Those some people have issues with. The main issue in some ways is that beekeepers, when they first were available, didn't use them very sensibly, and the varroa built up resistance to them, so they became not as effective. But as I say, they are the stronger chemicals, they are effective, but often these days people use them in rotation, so they might use Apiguard for a couple of years and then move on to Apistan for a year and then back to the Apiguard. So they can be used so that resistance doesn't build up. Apibioxyl and Oxavar are the trade names of the oxalic acid treatments, which is best used. People will argue a bit about this, that people want it to be used in the broodless period, and people will suggest that often that's suggested between Christmas and New Year. Some people will actually suggest that's earlier in December. I'm afraid, and because you're not looking in your colonies at that time, you need to pay money and take your choice. Most people tend to do it at the end of December. So what is IPM, Integrated Pest Management? It's used all over agriculture to control pests, so it's not unique to honeybees, but it is effective. And the concept is you have a threshold, and if something approaches that threshold, then you take an action. So the core principles are that you have an understanding of the pest, that you have a threshold, that you have multiple treatments or multiple things that you can use to tackle it, and that you try and keep a balance between environmental sensitivity and your operational sort of success. You want it to be, you don't want to kill the bees, but you do need, it's a management structure, it's a management technique. IPM and thresholds, you do get people asking, is treatment necessary? As we've said, monitoring is critical, because treating below a threshold is probably unnecessary, so don't always go there. You get little charts of kind of the hierarchy of integrated pest management, where your behaviour and things like open mesh floors come at the lower end of that, and then the sort of stronger chemicals come at the higher point of that. And you hope to do the control using the lower level measures, and you progress to the higher measures if that feels appropriate And if you feel that that's this diagram, by the way, don't take it too literally. It's an American diagram, so some of the details will be slightly different, but it's just meant to illustrate. So the words that get used for treatment options, biotechnical sounds really, ooh, what's that? It means open mesh floors, and it means drone uncapping. It means something that you physically do. The other treatments should always be authorised treatments only. Beekeepers can get a bit tight sometimes and go, hey, I'm not going to buy that expensive apibioxol because that's a tenner for my kind of 2 colonies. I'm going to buy a big box of oxalic acid that's off the shelf that only costs a fraction of that. It's not an authorised treatment. You are legally due to use, because you are selling a foodstuff, you are legally bound to use authorised chemicals only. Try not to go off label. It's not worth a couple of quid. Just to sort of to put it there. You do have to keep records. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we've talked about hard chemicals, the pyrethroids, and things like that. They're often easy to apply. They're often in strips. They can, if you use them too often, they can accumulate in wax and things like that. And we've talked about the issue with resistance if they're used consistently and if they're left in the hive for too long. You have to take the strips out after 6 to 8 weeks. If you leave them in, the Varroa breed resistance into the population. The soft chemicals, the thiols, the formic acids, things like that, lactic acid, they give a good degree of protection, but they can be a little fiddly sometimes. There can be multiple applications, they can be temperature sensitive. Big hives, small hives need variations in the sort of level you put in. So again, read the information, read the instructions, work with them. They will be effective, but you just have to kind of do a little bit more work for them. Going back to that earlier diagram again, this is just to enforce the fact that one thing is not going to solve the problem, and it's not going to solve the problem year on year. Use a treatment, rotate the treatments you use, always record the treatment on a veterinary medical directorate form, and you have to keep those records for 5 years. Because if a bee inspector or training standards or whatever say, okay, well, just show us your records, and you kind of slightly embarrassingly sit there and go, oh yeah, well, I've been using apibioxol, I've been using where's your records? If they find it in your honey, you'll be expected to prove where it came from. Have a record. It's just a simple piece of paper. You take a few details off the packet, scribble it down on a piece of paper with your name and address, stick it in a file. Okay, I'm going to get into an area now that's a little bit more contentious. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm going to try and be as balanced as I can with what I'm saying. I am on the treatment side if required. But there is a big debate about whether treatment is actually a short-term fix and whether it's actually stopping bees evolving and adapting natural evolution. Now, I don't think any of us want to use chemicals without a good reason. The trouble is, if you don't use chemicals, the losses of Varroa can be extremely high. They can be well over 90% or more of colonies can fail if they're not treated. It won't happen immediately, it will happen over time. Your personal beliefs are going to come into this, and where you sit on a kind of spectrum. The debates on this subject can become very nasty, and people can get quite sort of savage with each other. Oh, you murderer, you whatever. It can get heated, and to be honest, let's look at the evidence, and let's look at what people are saying, and let's not kind of get too sort of you do that, I do this. Some colonies do show enhanced hygienic behaviour and tolerance. Those are often known as survivor colonies. A huge amount of research is ongoing into survivor colonies. In some, we've talked about Apis cerana, where they uncap larvae that have got Varroa in it, and they manage the population. So that's Asian honeybees, how they've co-evolved. African bees have learnt a different technique of suppression. Cape bees, which are tip of South Africa, have sort of shortened the period that the bees are the adult bees take to develop in a cell to try and beat Varroa. The way that natural beekeepers will say that their bees, they're never treated but they never have a problem. Often if you dig down a bit, what you find is that they're small colonies, they're quite swarmy colonies, and they've had a brood break in the year where they've swarmed, and a brood break is natural Varroa control. So in often small swarmy colonies appear to be Varroa free, but it's because they're kind of tackling it in a different way. Ideally, we'd all buy bees or get bees from this survivor stock, but it's not as easy as that. If we are going to transition to chemical free, it is going to be a transition. It's not going to be us all standing up one morning and going, that's it, I'm not doing that anymore, because there's going to be a backlash in that if you go down that route. Okay, there's been some very recent research that's just come out, which is kind of interesting on this topic. The Swiss Bee Research Centre, they've looked at 30 years of survivor colony research. The first thing they say is, Varroa is still number one killer of bees, closely followed by number two, or sometimes equal footing, beekeepers are probably the other biggest killer of bees, but that's another story. The paper looked at all of the programs for survivor colonies over this 30-year period, and they quite clearly state that what they came back with was a lot of people in the first couple of years going, hey, we've got a magic solution and this is working and it's working well, but those seem to peter out, and there was no real significant reports of long-term success. It didn't conclude that the whole thing is a waste of time. However, what it has concluded is that the selection strategies that have been tried haven't made for large-scale solutions yet. And what they're strongly recommending is that small groups that are kind of working independently really need to start working together. Actually, then there might be a way forward. But it's going to take time. It's going to be a transition. And the DOI down there is the full paper. It's quite a long one, I warn you, if you want to have a read of that. But that's a kind of interesting middle point. It's not saying it's impossible. It's saying that there's some evidence that short-term it works, but that long-term practical solutions for the majority of beekeepers don't appear to be there yet. So just to summarise before we move on to the other sort of quick section on doing a disease inspection, Varroa is hard to fight. Don't make any two ways about it. It is like weeds in the garden, and if you're a gardener, you'll know what a pain that is, what a cyclical nature it is, and how hard it is to stay on top of it, and how quickly, if you take your eye off the ball, it comes back. Most colonies, apart from Isle of Man in this country, and a couple of islands like Colonsay off Scotland, have got Varroa in this country. You will probably have it. The threshold of your colony being at risk is 1,000 mites in the colony, and we're trying to keep it below that. One thing about, excuse me, I'll just have a drink a sec. One thing that you do often hear about treatment colonies is that if you don't treat a colony, or if there's a beekeeper who doesn't, it's not the impact that you have on your own bees that is the end of it. As a colony collapses, it can act as what's been described as a mite bomb. As the colony collapses, not all the bees will just die out, but it will reach a point where they will abscond. That can be a spread to other colonies. They've mapped the movement of bees from a collapsing colony to other colonies, and it can be a significant transmission route. And that final part, some stock is resistant, and that's a great thing, but we don't necessarily have all the answers yet how our bees are going to get from, Western honeybees are going to get from where they are now to where we would like them to be in a short period of time. So while we're in that limbo, we may have to act. Whether you like it or not, But monitoring and using this escalating pyramid of kind of treatments is where we are mostly at the moment. And finally, Tom Seeley, most of you all heard of, who's the sort of rock star of beekeeping at the moment. He's done a lot of research in the Arnott Forest in sort of New York State with colonies who appear to have no Varroa. One of the interesting things that it has been found is that some people have, and including him, have sort of said, hey, these bees have evolved. But he was asked a question a little while ago, what happens if those colonies are brought back into the average apiary? And he quite clearly says they die out. Because it's less that they've evolved, but when they're not in close proximity to other colonies and they're left to their own devices and they maybe swarm more often, they kind of regulate in a different way. So natural selection, he's arguing in a paper a little while ago, is going to favour strains of mites. But what you can get is that Varroa can kind of work out what's a weak colony, and it can be attracted to weak colonies. So you just need to be careful. A lot of people will quote Tom Seeley at you as a reason for not treating. With Tom Seeley's work, you sometimes have to dig down that little bit deeper to find actually there's a headline that people can pull out of it, but actually the full message is just a little bit more complicated than that. So don't always, if someone starts quoting Tom Seeley at you, just think about it a little bit and see that actually his work is a bit more balanced than maybe the one line that they've chosen to pull out. Okay, at that moment, just let me pull back from this. I hope that's been useful to you. If you've got any questions, what we'll try and do is in the bit of time once we've finished this talk, probably under separate little headings, because Annette will answer the questions on wax wraps. I'll pick up the other stuff. If you've got any questions, come back to us then. It's the one thing that doesn't really work in this format is doing questions. If you haven't seen, we've got an email that'll probably come around tomorrow to you. Our speaker next month is a guy called Giles Budge, who's a sort of very prominent researcher who works at the University of Newcastle and has worked at the National Bee Unit. He's going to talk to us about foul brood. He has asked if he could do the lecture by Zoom, and that's his preference, and that's what we'll go with. So next month we'll be using a different kind of platform, and it'll be by invitation. So there'll be an email coming around about that shortly. So this final little talk, which is brief, if you're getting bored, will be done soon. Disease inspections. So a couple of times a year, you should do a dedicated disease inspection on your bees. You may find, and you should find, that as you're going through your colonies every time, you're keeping an eye out for anything that looks strange. But at times, you need to kind of do it specifically. And on those inspections, you're doing it as a single task. So why are we doing it? We want healthy colonies. Keep an eye on anything abnormal at any inspection and check it out. But a full disease inspections, especially in the spring and the late summer. Single purpose inspection. You're not looking for the queen. You're not wondering about feeding. You're not this, that, the other. You're doing one point. We can have disease in adult bees, or we can have disease in brood. So we need to be both. If you wear reading glasses, to be honest, wear your reading glasses when you're doing a disease inspection, or you're going to miss. You could easily miss something. So a standard frame of healthy brood. Now we all know that not every frame looks like that, but this is the classic impression. You've got your rugby ball shape of a brood in the middle with a few holes. You'll never have 0 holes. Some people will say that's where the heater bees go to keep the brood warm. Around it, often you've got larvae outside the seal patch. Then you've got an arc of pollen, and then you've got an arc of honey. Classic, good-looking frame. Not any perforated cells, nothing obviously wrong with that. The larvae are looking C-shaped, pearly white, well segmented. I'd be happy with that. You all should be. know what's good, and then you can spot what's wrong. Don't expect every frame to look like that, otherwise you're going to drive yourself a bit bonkers. But if you've got a patch in the middle of it that's got empty cells, have a look. You'll probably find there's eggs in there, and that the cycle's just starting again, that the queens, they've hatched out and the queen started laying back in the middle. But it's worth having that extra look. So what do you need for a disease inspection? Not a lot. You need your normal kit. Ideally, you're going to be keeping your hive tools in a bucket of washing soda. So wash them between each hive. Put them back in the washing soda at the end of the day. The washing soda mix is 1 part washing soda to 5 parts water. So that's just the ratio. A scouring pad chucked in the bucket is useful because the propolis just helps to kind of clean it up. The other really useful thing that's happening to use is toothpick or matchsticks, because sometimes you want to look into the cells and poke out what's in there. That's quite a good tool to do with. So your inspection is pretty much as normal. You take the roof off. If you stack that on top of you stack the supers in your roof because you're not so bothered about what's going on in there. If you've got a double brew box as normal, you normally check the lower box first. If you've got several boxes, supers, and a second brew box sitting around, just put another crown board on top of them, because if you've got potential for a disease colony, you don't want lots of bees flying around or other bees coming in to rob it. So just pop a crown board on top of the open boxes. Ideally, if you can, without losing the queen, remove a couple of outer frames to give yourself some room to work in that box, because you're going to have to shake all the bees off. Work through the outer frames. They're not really of much interest to you. Maybe take a couple out so you've got space to work. When you come to frames of brood, you're going to need to lift the frames off, and then you're going to have to shake all the bees off that frame. So shake them off, obviously, into the box, raise the frame up about halfway out of the box, shake hard. Try not to, it takes a little bit of a technique, but try not to smash the frames into the sides of the box or whatever, because that's just going to agitate the bees. You get a bit of a technique going, but you want those frames, by the time you look at it, to be as bee free as possible, because you know that you cannot see through bees, and if it's covered in bees, you're not going to be doing the sort of detailed check that you need to be doing. What a bee inspector will do is, as soon as he sees a perforated capping, he'll be there with a corner of his hive tool or a cocktail stick, and he'll be straight in at that, because the perforated cappings are the ones where there's probably something wrong. Now, it might be that it's just not been sealed yet, but that's often means that the very centre of the cap isn't quite finished. If it's off centre and if it's a bit ragged, it's been reopened, and if it's been reopened, it's the bees have detected something's wrong in there and they've reopened it. So there's a reason the bees did that. Likewise, there's a reason a bee inspector will be looking there. If you use a cocktail stick to investigate that, you can just kind of break open the rest of the capping, maybe fish out the larvae, have a little look at it. What's it looking like? Once you've used that cocktail stick, chuck it in your smoker, burn it, and that's sort of a way to dispose of it, and without any risk of spreading disease. If you're looking for things like particularly American foul brood, not just holding the frame flat in front of you, but tilting the frame away from you at about 45 degrees, AFB leaves a distinctive scale. American foul brood leaves a distinctive scale, which is very hard to remove in the bottom of the cells, the sort of where gravity pulls it down. Holding the frame at 45 degrees and getting the light right in it will reveal those scales. So it's something to get into a technique of doing. You know, when you're trying to find eggs, sometimes you have to move the frame around to get the light in it just right to see the eggs in the bottom. It's the same sort of process with AFB. AFB is so rare in this area, you may not have a chance to actually check to get practical experience, and I really hope you don't. But it's just knowing the theory is useful. Once you finish, close your hive, wash all your tools, wash your bee suit, make sure everything's, because you don't want to then trog off to the next apiary or go to a friend's apiary and transfer something. Obviously, if you see anything worrying, there's action you need to take. I'm going to rattle through quickly just what the big diseases we're looking for are. American foul brood, pepper potty brood pattern, sunken greasy caps. This is the one where if you put a matchstick into the cell with the kind of gloopy remains of a larvae in it, and then you pull the matchstick back, you'll get an inch or so of what they call roping. You can see it maybe in the picture. The gloop won't just sort of, the gloop will come away with the matchstick. That's serious. The dark scale is a later stage of it. Again, we've just talked about how you spot that. You need to contact, if you've got suspicions of that, it's a notifiable disease, you have to contact the bee inspectors immediately. Their action, if they run a field test and confirm it, I'm afraid sadly will be to burn all your frames and your bees, and you have to dig the hole for that to happen in. It's a radical solution. Thankfully, we're very, very low on AFB in this region. We're one of those few areas of the country, but that's what they have to do. This is what American foul brood can look like. So you can see in the upper picture the dark, sunken, greasy capping. In the lower picture, that will be looking down and seeing the scale stuck to the bottom of the cell. European foul brood, the second of the notifiable brood diseases. Again, it's bacterial in nature. So we've talked about when we see our larvae in the cells, they should be pearly white, well segmented, nice, fat and juicy looking. However, if they're looking all twisted and they've gone a bit yellowy, they look a bit like they're melted. Sometimes there can be a smell as well, but that's a secondary thing. And in an advanced stage, you can get a loose brown scale, so it'll shake out if you shake the cell. If you're seeing something like that, again, you need to be onto your bee inspector. In this area, the outcome will probably be the same if the diagnosis is confirmed, that it will be the burning of the hive contents. Some places use antibiotics, but to be honest, those aren't a real solution. They just mask the problem. EFB often shows up in springtime a bit more when we're getting an explosion of brood, but it can appear all year round. Don't expect any of these diseases to sort of suddenly pop up on the full scale. They can start very small in just a couple of cells and build up. So be kind of looking. Some pictures of European foul brood, pepper potty brood, not a very nice brood pattern, but looking in the cells, we've got these larvae, and the larvae don't look right. They're not pearly white, well segmented. Chalk brood. Okay, we've all probably seen chalk brood. Don't panic about this one. It's very common. It's fungal disease. You'll see these white mummies in the cells. Looks a bit like a fried egg. When they've been longer around, you'll get these grey, sometimes even black sort of little mummies on it. It's a sign of stress in a colony sometimes. It's a sign of a queen having a predisposition to be a bit chalk brood heavy. There's no treatment. It's not serious. Just don't ignore it. Make a note of it. But the only thing you could really do about it is requeen if it got bad. Some people will suggest putting a banana skin on top of the hive inside the crown board, and it makes the bees clear out more of the. I'm not sure it's a treatment, but it means the bees clear out more of the mummies. Sac brood again is quite common. It's a viral infection, but it's not a severe one, and it's called Chinese slipper sometimes because you get this distinctive the head section of the bee pointing up in the cell. And if you fish that out with a matchstick or whatever, you will get it'll be this like fluid sac. Again, not serious, worth noting in your records. Just deal with it. Ball brood, can't ever remember seeing ball brood myself, but it's caused by wax moth, and it's a larvae with the cap of the cell just disappeared. The viruses we've talked about now. The viruses that come with Varroa is the most common one is deformed wing virus, where you will see a bee with shriveled wings. It's a pointless bee because it has no function really in the hive. Once it's got past its early days, can't fly, can't do anything. If you're seeing that in a hive, Varroa has probably reached a quite advanced level, and probably treatment is urgent, if not overdue. It's quite easy to spot. Chronic bee paralysis virus is one that's crept up on us over the last few years and is now becoming quite prominent. It's a little hard to diagnose. There are two different types of it, but often you'll see these black shiny bees like the one in the centre of the lower picture there. Their hairs have come off. It can be linked to overcrowding in a hive. You might see bees crawling on the ground outside. You might see bees dead outside, and so it can sometimes be mixed up with poisoning. You can sometimes see bees trembling and clustering on tops of frames, just acting oddly. That's not something that you've normally seen. Again, because it's got two different types, it's a little bit hard to diagnose, but it would be one to have a conversation with your bee inspector. It's not notifiable, but it would be one to have a conversation about. And that, folks, is about it. Thank you very much for sticking with us this evening. As I say, we'll be around for questions on any of this stuff earlier. Sort of after this, we'll put a couple of topic starters up once we're finished. I hope these are continuing to be useful. As I say, we're still stuck with lockdown. I don't know when that's going to lift. Neither do you. We'll keep on going with these until the world changes and we're back able to meet face to face again. Thanks very much for coming along. Hope that was of use to you. And as I say, any questions, we'll be around for those. But I'm going to end this feed now.